ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وسلم تسليما كثيرا. أما بعد, a quick revisit of what we did last week, and it has to do with gold and silver, the standard that is used to determine the nisab for cash, money. And in our last discussion, we mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that if you had 200 silver coins and a year passed over it, you have to give 5 of them, which is 2.5%. And if you have 20 gold coins and a year passes over it, you have to give half of a gold coin, 2.5% again. We said in our discussion that each gold coin was 4.25 grams. 4.25 grams. And so if you needed 20 of them, that would give you 85 grams, or 2.733 troy ounces. 85 grams is equivalent to 2.733 troy ounces. This is gold. Silver is a little bit less in value. Okay, and we said in those days, 10 silver coins was equivalent to 7 gold coins. 10 silver coins were equivalent to 7 gold coins. And knowing that, we said we could determine what each silver coin was valued. And so we found out that each silver coin is valued 2.975 grams. 2.975 grams for each silver coin. Now, the hadith said you needed 200 of them. 200 of them. So 200 times 2.975, this is where we get 595 grams. 595 grams. Or 19.13 troy ounces of silver. That is what you need before silver is zakatable. You need that amount. For gold, you need 85 grams or 2.733 troy ounces. We also discussed and we said that there is a difference amongst the Ahlul Ilm concerning which should be used to determine the nisab. Should it be gold or should it be silver? And we discussed that, the differences amongst the Ahlul Ilm concerning that. However, there is an additional discussion that arises, and there seems to be an agreement amongst some of the Ahlul Ilm, especially the permanent committee and some of our standing scholars, that if you have cash, if you have some money, and you have gold or silver, and that silver or gold hasn't reached the nisab. Okay, the gold is not 2.733 troy ounces. The silver is not the level where it's supposed to be in terms of troy ounces either. That is 18.13 troy ounces. If you have less than that of gold or silver, there seems to be an agreement amongst the scholars that you take the cash that you have, and if you have sufficient cash that would, if let's say you have half the nisab of gold, and you have the cash that would make up the next half, for them you have to give zakat on the full amount here. The same thing with silver. If you have silver, half of the nisab in silver, and the rest you have in cash, okay, you have sufficient that would bring it up to the value of where the silver meets the nisab, that you have to give 2.5% of that in zakat. That is a discussion that we have, and it is novel because now we're dealing with the paper currency and what have you. And so that is the position that we find amongst the permanent committee and others amongst the scholars of our day and time concerning that. Now, there is another discussion concerning gold and silver, and it has to do with jewelry. It has to do with jewelry. Here again, we do have some differences amongst the Ahlul Ilm, and the reason for the difference is because there were some of the companions who had jewelry, gold and silver jewelry, and no zakah was given. Imam Malik in his Muwatta, he narrates from Abdurrahman ibn al-Qasim from his father, that Aisha radiallahu anha, she used to take care of the daughters of her brother, and they were under her care. لَهُنَّ حُلِيٌّ فَلَا تُخْرِجُ مِنْ حُلِيِّهِنَّ الزَّكَاةَ. And she would give no zakah on the jewelry that they had, that they wore. That particular narration is sound. We have another narration from Imam Malik from Nafi' that Abdullah ibn Umar كان يحلي بناته وجواريه الذهب ثم لا يخرج من حليهن الزكاة. That he would have his daughters, his right-hand possession, and he would give them jewelry of gold, and he would actually have no zakah paid on that jewelry. And so this is a position that some of the Ahlul Ilm hold. And for this reason, Imam Malik had a specific position based on these practices of some of the scholars of the Salaf who are from amongst the Sahaba. Okay, that if the jewelry that you have is not being utilized for purposes of adornment, okay, he says, من كان عنده تبر أو حلي من ذهب أو فضة لا ينتفع به في لبس إن عليه فيه الزكاة في كل عام. If you have it and it's just sitting there and it's not used for decoration, for adornment, the sister is not wearing the jewelry, it's just sitting there. He says this type of jewelry, which is just sitting there, is zakatable. يُوزَنُ فَيُخَذُ رُبُعُ عُشْرِهِ. And it should be weighed and 2.5% should be paid. Okay? If it is less than the nisab, which is required of gold and silver, and there is no zakah, obviously. Okay? And he said, it is only zakatable إنما تكون في الزكاة إذا كان إنما يمسكه لغير لبس. If you are not using it and it's just sitting there, then it is zakatable. Okay? Then it's zakatable. And so he had that position. However, whenever you have differences amongst the Ahlul Ilm and you have a clear text from the Prophet ﷺ, that is given preference over the positions that might be held by others, whether it's a Sahabi or someone else. And we have a narration which is collected by Abi Dawood in his Sunan on the authority of Amr bin Shu'ayb from his father, from his grandfather. أن امرأة أتت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ومعها ابنة لها. A lady came to the Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم, and along with her, she had her daughter. وفي يد ابنتها مسكتان غليظتان من ذهب. And her daughter had two huge gold bracelets. فقال لها أتعطين زكاة هذا? So the Prophet ﷺ questioned the mother, do you give the zakah of this? قالت لا. She said no. He said, أيسرك أن يصورك الله بهما يوم القيامة سوارين من نار? Would it please you that Allah should give you two bracelets of fire on يوم القيامة? قال فخلعتهما فألقتهما إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وقالتهما لله عز وجل ولرسوله. She took them off, placed them in front of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, and said, they are for Allah and His Messenger صلى الله عليه وسلم. The fact that the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم questioned, do you give the zakah for this? Is a clear indication that the jewelry worn by the sister is zakatable. The jewelry worn by the sister is zakatable. We have another narration from Aisha radiallahu anha. And she said, دخل علي رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فرأى في يدي فتخات من ورق. The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam entered my chamber and he saw me wearing fatakhat, okay, some huge rings, and they were made of silver. These were silver rings. فقال ما هذه يا عائشة? He said, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam questioned her, what is this, O Aisha? She says, صنعتهن أتزين لك يا رسول الله. I made these so that I may adorn myself for you, O Messenger of Allah. قال أتؤدين زكاته? He questioned, he said, do you give the zakah of this? قلت لا. Oh, mashallah. I said, no, what Allah wills. قال هو حسبك من النار. He said, this is sufficient to place you in the fire, not discharging the responsibility of giving the zakah. So that particular narration, along with the previous narration, is an indication that jewelry is zakatable. The jewelry is zakatable. Now, Ibn Hazm, in his book Al-Muhalla bil-Athar, he discusses this from a different angle. Because to him, the narratives that were mentioned a few moments ago were not sound. And he said, if we only had these athar, or these particular narratives, I would not say that it was binding to give zakah on jewelry. He said, however, it has been صح عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم في رقة ربع العشر. It has been authenticated and sound from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, narrated with a sound chain from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he said concerning silver you should give rubul ushur, 2.5%. And he said, ليس فيما دون 5 أواق من الورق صدقة. And if you have less than 200 silver coins, it is not zakatable. So here in these particular narrations, he said that the jewelry is, if it is silver, according to these narratives, the responsibility of zakat should be discharged. Because these narratives include.
He said, Mom, can I ask a last thing?
He says, as for gold, it is soundly reported from the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he said, anyone who possesses gold and does not discharge the responsibility of zakat, on Yawm al-Qiyamah, plates of fire shall be heated up for him. This is an indication that gold, that zakat concerning every type of gold is binding. Every type of gold is binding. And then he discusses, he said, we know that it is not every amount that is zakatable. And we know that it is not to be given every day, but there is a specific time in the text. And so because of that, we say that if it is not a certain amount, according to the Shara, according to Allah's deen, it is not zakatable. And we know from the text that if a year doesn't pass over, it is also not zakatable. So he looks at the other narrations that are sound, where giving zakah on gold or giving zakah on silver has been made binding. He says in jewelry, if it's gold or silver, it comes under those general narratives. So no exception should be made when it comes to it being zakatable. That position that Ibn Hazm holds in his book Al-Muhalla is pretty strong and it's straightforward. Okay. Now, we also see in this particular narration that the zakah or discharging this responsibility is on the lady herself who owns the jewelry. Sheikh bin Baz, rahimahullah ta'ala, when he discusses this, he says, فَالزَّوْجِ عَلَيْهَا زَكَاةُ ذَهَبِهَا. It is binding on the wife to discharge the zakah for the jewelry that she has of gold. Okay? And if she doesn't have any wealth, she should sell some of the gold in order to discharge this responsibility, or she can borrow some wealth from someone in order to discharge this responsibility. Or her husband may do this if Allah guides him to do so, that he may do this with her permission. فَلَا بَأْسٍ. And there's nothing wrong. Or her father, or her brother, بِإِذْنِهَا فَلَا بَأْسٍ. With her permission, they may discharge this responsibility on her behalf. Otherwise, the Sheikh says, وَإِلَّا فَتَبْقَ الزَّكَاةُ دَيْنًا فِي ذِمَّتِهَا حَتَّى تُخْرِجَهَا بِبَيْعِ شَيْءٍ مِنْ مَالِهَا حَتَّى تُزَكِّيهَا. Otherwise, this remains a debt that is owed until she either sells something to discharge this responsibility and gets herself free from it. This position also was held by Sheikh concerning the husband or the brother or the father, if the wife agrees that they may discharge this on her behalf. Otherwise, it's her responsibility to take care of this. Otherwise, it's her responsibility to discharge this. So, there are, as we mentioned, differences of opinion concerning the jewelry, but once the text has been proven to be sound, then the positions that are held which go against it really is not that strong. And this was the position of the Sahaba, some of the Sahaba. They disagreed with Ibn Umar and Aisha radiallahu anha. We have a narration from Alqamah, the wife of Abdullah, mentioned, he says, Inna li haliyan af'uzakihi. I have jewelry, should I discharge the zakat? He says, إِذَا بَلَغَ مِئَةَ دِرْهَمْ فَزَكِّيهِ. If it reaches the equivalent of 200 gold coins, then discharge this responsibility. قالت في حجر بني أخ ليتامى فأضعه فيهم. قال نعم. I have some orphans that belong to some of the children of my brother. They're orphans and they're under my care. Should I give this to them? He said yes. Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, he said, as the kaf al-huli wal-dhahab wal-fiddah. He also pointed out that yes, the zakat concerning the jewelry is an obligation concerning gold and silver. This was the same position held by Sa'id ibn Musayyib. He mentioned, he says, when he was questioned, al-huli, zakat, al-dhahab wal-fiddah, zakat, gold and silver, is there any zakat? He said, no. The person said, then it will be, if she does it every year, it will just, there'll come a time when she has none. He says, well, no, it doesn't matter. Actually, that's not correct, because once you go beneath the nisab, it's no longer zakatable. Al-Zuhri, he says, as zakat al-hulli fi kulli aam, that zakat should be given each year on the jewelry that a person has. Of course, if it reaches the nisab. This was the position of Jabir ibn Zayd when he was questioned about it, and others. So it's a very common position amongst the Ahlul Ilm concerning jewelry that the women wear. Okay? There's more discussion concerning that, but what I mentioned is a safe position to hold. The other discussion that arises has to do with trade items. And this discussion also has a number of differences amongst the Ahlul Ilm. We have some narration, for example, that Tabari mentions with a sound change from Mujaahid concerning the verse, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu anfiqu min tayyibati ma kasabtum qala min at-tijara. Where Allah says, O you who believe, spend out of the good things that you have earned. Mujaahid said this refers to tijara, or trade. Ibn Umar, al-Bayhaqi mentions with a sound chain of narration. It's also found in the Musnad al-Shafi'i. From Ibn Umar, he says, لَيْسَ فِي الْعُرُودِ زَكَاتٌ إِلَّا مَا كَانَ لِلتِّجَارَةِ. There is no zakat due on goods that you have unless it's set aside for purposes of trade. Okay? So those are narrations that indicate yes. Ata ibn Abi Rabah, he said sadaqah is due on raw metals, whether it's gold or silver. Okay? Whether it's used for trade or not, whether it's been smelted or not, whether it's in jewelry of the lady or not. There is no sadaqah on pearls, lu'lu, zabarjad, or yaqut, chrysolite or sapphire, wala fusus or other precious stones, wala ardin la yudar, or trade items that you have that are not actively being purchased and sold. You have them in stock, store away in storage. He said there is no zakah on those. فإن كان شيء من ذلك يدار ففيه الصدقة في ثمنه حين يباع. He said, however, if these things now are taken out from storage and you're actively engaged in selling, he said the sadaqah should be given at the time of the sale. Something should be given in sadaqah. So here, Paul has a different approach concerning what should be given and the amount. Okay, nothing was specified, but other than what a person, out of the kindness of his heart, gives. Okay. So we have these different positions from the Ahlul Ilm. Imam Malik in his Muwatta also, he makes a distinction between the goods that you have in storage, okay, and that are not being utilized right now, even though they have been purchased with the intent of trade, that there is no zakah on them, even if you keep it for years until it is sold. And then you give the zakah for 1 year. As for the items that you have that are being sold and traded on a daily basis, these things should be calculated annually and zakah be given. So we do have a range of different positions concerning the zakah on trade items. Now, one of the narrations that we have, or the narration that is used for saying that trade items are zakatable, is a narration from Samura ibn Jundub. Now this narration, which was collected by Abu Dawood, and it's from Sulaiman ibn Musa, it starts from a person called Muhammad ibn Dawood. Now this particular narration has a lot of individuals that are not sound. Okay, Ja'far ibn Sa'd, Ibn Abdul Barr, he says, Laysa ibn Qawi. The person that he narrates from the Khubayb, the same thing has been said. Hafiz ibn Hajar says, Majhul, he's not known. Sulaiman ibn Samura, same thing, Majhul, not known. For this reason, Al-Dhabi, concerning this particular narration, he said, وَبِكُلِّ حَالٍ هَذَا إِسْنَادٌ مُظْلَمْ لَا يَنْهَضْ بِحُكْمٍ. This is a dark chain, and it cannot be used for any legislation. This narration that we're discussing is the narration from Samura ibn Jundub, where he said, أما بعد فإن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم كان يأمرنا أن نخرج الصدقة من الذي نعد للبيع. The Prophet صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم used to command us to give the sadaqah, that is zakah, for the things that we have set aside for purposes of trade. The Prophet صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم used to command us to give the sadaqah for those on those items that we have set aside for trade purposes. Now that particular narration, like we said, is not sound at all. And it is one of those narrations actually that is still used, and you see it when the discussion arises concerning trade items, along with certain general hadith about giving and discharging the responsibility on the wealth that you have. Okay? But specific textual evidence that we have concerning this, that particular narration cannot be used because of how weak the chain is. Amongst the people who actually had objections to this was a Zahiriyya. And Ibn Hazm, he went to some length in explaining why you cannot use that weak narration and why there is no zakah on items that have been set aside for trade purposes. And he said, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, لَيْسَ فِي مَدُونَ خَمْسِ أَوَاقٍ مِنَ الْوَرَقِ صَدَقَةٍ. وَلَيْسَ فِي مَا دُونَ خَمْسِ ذَوْدٍ مِنَ الْإِبْلِ صَدَقَةٌ. The Prophet ﷺ said, if you have less than this amount of silver, there's no zakat due. If you have less than this amount of camels, less than 5 camels, no zakat is due. And so he also mentioned if you have less than 40 sheep, no zakat is due. But if it is viewed as a trade item, you don't look at that, you look at the value. So 1 camel might be zakatable. He says this position where you may have 1 camel because you're looking at the value of the camel, it may be zakatable. It goes against that authentic narration where the Prophet ﷺ said, there is no zakah unless you have 5 camels or more. So how are you going to say, using a weak narration, and you don't have any specific text actually to go against the strong one, to say it's zakatable? He said, the Prophet ﷺ also said, لَيْسَ عَلَى الْمُسْلِمِ فِي عَبْدِهِ وَلَا فِي فَرَسِهِ صَدَقَةٌ إِلَّا صَدَقَةُ الْفِطْرِ. There is no zakah binding on a person concerning his slave or his horse. No sadaqah, this is the zakah, except the sadaqatul fitr. And he's saying, but, and also the Prophet ﷺ said, قَالَ عَفَوْتُ عَنْ صَدَقَةِ الْخَيْرِ. I have pardoned you and given you a concession that there is no sadaqah on horses. He said, and when the Prophet ﷺ was asked about horses, he said there are 3. For a person, he gets a reward. For a person, it's a covering, and for a person, it's a sin. When he was asked about donkeys, he says, nothing has been revealed to me except this general verse. Whoever does the smallest amount of good, he shall see it. He said, but when you look at the position that is held concerning trade items, if you have a horse that is viewed as an item of trade, it's now zakatable. If it's set aside for trade as zakatable, when the Prophet ﷺ said there is none. There is no zakah on horses. This particular narration is sound. How are you going to do away with this and use a narration that is not sound, and you don't have any real specification concerning this? And so he has a lengthy discussion concerning that and points out that this is not a strong position at all. Now, actually, there is an agreement amongst the Ahlul Ilm that a person actually gives something. Okay, you hear the discussion about there being ijma'. There is a consensus that a person concerning the wealth that he earns from trade, that a person gives something. The difference is what should be given. Is it the 2.5%? Does it have to be calculated like you calculate all of the other things where you have specific text? That difference is there. Okay? And we've seen that at the beginning concerning the statements from Imam Malik, Al-Pa, and others. Right? And it's for that reason that in this day and time, there is a difference amongst the Ahlul Ilm. There is a difference amongst the Ahlul Ilm. And amongst the scholars that we have in this day and time, who they say that something should be given, but not the specification that the majority of the scholars say, where you have to now, if you have, for example, a warehouse full of goods, the intent is to sell them at some time, that you have to go and calculate everything that is in that warehouse. Look at the value of it. And whatever the overall value is, you have to give 2.5% of it. Okay? Amongst the scholars who disagree with that position in this day and time is Sheikh Nasiruddin al-Albani, also Sheikh Mubarak and others. Shawkani also disagreed with that. And he mentions in his book, Tamam al-Minna, He says, وَالْحَقَّ إِنَّ الْقَوْلِ بِوُجُوبِ الزَّكَاةِ عَلَى عُرُوضِ التِّجَارَةِ مِمَّا لَا دَلِيلَ عَلَيْهِ فِي الْكِتَابِ وَالسُّنَّةِ الصَّحِيحَةِ. He said, actually, the truth is the statement that it is binding to give zakah on these trade items. We don't have any sound evidence. لا دليل عليه في الكتاب والسنة الصحيحة. No evidence. Yeah, when he's speaking about evidence, we're talking about specific evidence. Otherwise, you have general texts that have been used. Nothing in the Quran or the authentic Sunnah. He says, and it goes against the principle al-bara'atul asliyah, that you're not responsible for something unless you have something sound. And it's been specified. And this is supported, he said, in the khutbatul Hajjat al-Wada', where the Prophet, in the farewell pilgrimage, where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he pointed out, he said, surely your blood, your wealth, your honor, your bodies are sacred, like the sanctity of this day, like the sanctity of this month, and the sanctity of this town. Have I not conveyed? O Allah, bear witness. He said, this particular principle is not easily done away with or to specify, even though you may have some statement that is authentic from Abdullah ibn Umar, where he said there is no zakah on trade items unless it's set aside. There is no zakah on goods unless it's set aside for trade. He said, this, in addition to it being something mawquf, meaning it's not attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it doesn't explain the nisab, how much it's needed. Okay? وَلَا مَا يَجِبْ, how much should be given. And he said, but in spite of that, this particular statement can be viewed where a person gives what he is comfortable in giving. Okay? And this is what we have for Yadful, and it is included in those general statements that command spending. O you who believe, spend out of the good that we have provided for you. And the statement, وَآتُ حَقُّهُ يَوْمَ حَصَادِهِ, and give out of the yields on the day of harvest. And the statement of Allah's Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there isn't a day when the slave gets it except that two angels descend, one of them saying, "O Allah, give the person who spent in return for what he has given. O Allah, gives the person who is miserly destruction." So the position of Abdullah ibn Abi Rabah and others, Sheikh Nasser seems to agree with that position because of the lack of sound evidence, specific evidence concerning this issue. Sheikh Muqbil in his book Ijabatu Sa'il held a similar position. He said, عروض التجارة الصحيح من أقوال أهل العلم ليس فيها زكاة. He said the trade items, what is sound of the statement of the Ahlul Ilm is that there is no zakat due on. He says, however, the wealth, لكن المال الذي يأتي منها إذا حال عليها الحول ففيه الزكاة. The money that is earned from it, if a year passes over it, of course, if it reaches the nisab, then it is zakatable. He says, وهذا اختيار الشوكاني في كتاب نيل الأوطار وفي كتاب سيل الجرار المتتفق على حدائق الأزهار. This is the position held by Shawkani in both of his books, Nail al-Awtar and Sail al-Jarrar. He says, هذا هو الصحيح. He says, this is what is correct. We have examined the evidences concerning zakat on these trade items. فَإِذَا هِي أَدِلَّ لَا تَثْبُتْ. And we find that these evidences are not sound. And some of them, it mentions that the Prophet ﷺ commanded the zakat. Can it be taken from al-baz? He says, but we have found nothing sound that can be used as evidence. And the principle is the sanctity of the wealth of the Muslim. وَمَنْ حَبَّ أَن يَتَصَدَّقْ بِمَالِهِ أَوْ أَن يَتَصَدَّقْ مِنْ مَالِهِ فَلْيَتَصَدَّقْ. However, who would like to give charity with his wealth or from his wealth, then let him do so. So those are the two. Those are the some of the discussion that we have concerning trade items. For those who are convinced that it is zakatable, you have to be diligent and remember that it is a process where now whatever you have set aside, whether it's in storage, once it's set aside with the intent of trade, it has to be calculated. You have to go through, and the value, though, the value now that it holds is what you have to look at. Okay, and then 2.5% of that whole value. So if you have two storage filled with items, no matter how small they are, it has to be calculated. That's the position that is held by the majority of the Ahlul in this day and time. But the evidence and the discussion concerning it is what you have seen a few moments ago. Now, there is a lot of claim concerning ijma', there being a consensus. And we don't have time to get into that discussion, but inshallah, we'll deal with that concept with Allah's permission when we meet again, inshallah, next week. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.